Please pray with me. O Lord, take my lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for you. Amen. Finding a way forward when none seems possible. Has it ever happened to you when you're caught between a rock and a hard place with no good options? Behind you is Pharaoh's army, bearing down on you with all their might to enslave you. They have all the power, and you have only yourself and maybe the little ones or the elders in tow relying on you. Ahead, on the other side, is the sea. Treacherous water, too wide to swim across, too deep to wade through. Have you ever been caught in a situation like this, between two impossible alternatives? And then, somehow, in a way completely unexpected, you find a way forward when none would seem possible. If you've ever had this experience, then as folks in the newspaper biz say, your story has legs. It'll keep on going for a long time. It will be told and retold. For millennia, the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea has had legs. It's been retold as the central story for Jews, interpreted to mean that God was with them. Because what else could have explained that they were once slaves and then they became free? Certainly this huge reversal was not due to Pharaoh's gracious behavior. The Egyptian king had let his free labor pool go only under duress, and once they did, he changed his mind. What was I thinking? Because of course, when have the economically and militarily powerful ever given up their advantage willingly? No, the Hebrews' escape couldn't be credited to the sudden beneficence of the powerful Pharaoh. Neither could they credit their human leader, Moses. The Hebrew people always find fault with Moses. This time they cry out, "Why did you leave us? Why didn't you leave us where we were?" As if there wasn't enough land to bury us in Egypt. You brought us out here to bury us in the sand. The Bible always stresses how human Moses is. He doesn't even want to be their leader. He lacks confidence. He stutters. Unlike that virile Charleston Heston who played Moses in the movies, the biblical Moses is utterly without charisma. It takes him countless trips to Pharaoh's palace before anything pans out. Things get worse for the Hebrew slaves before they get better. Moses couldn't get the credit for the people finding a way forward, not Moses alone. Could it be natural phenomena that saved the Hebrews? You know, the winds and the waters and the tides? I am intrigued, I'll confess, by the hypothesis of what's called a Reed Sea, double-E-E-D, instead of the Red Sea. Some location that the Hebrews stumbled across that's like Cape Cod Bay, where the receding tides can transform the churning ocean waters within hours into sand flats that stretch for miles. But though travelers who had never before seen tidal flats might at first label those routine tides as God's saving miraculous action, once the regularity of tidal swings became common knowledge among the people, how could the story still really have legs for millennia? Now, none of us will know exactly what happened, and maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's enough to know that some real-life experience convinced a group of people that there is a God who wills their freedom from what had enslaved them. And despite their great fear, when they could not imagine how they could ever go forward, they nevertheless became free. They did find a way when none had been thought possible. Maybe the crux of the story is that despite their fear, they made a choice to go forward in trust and hope. And that's what made all the difference. You see, in Cecil B. DeMille's movie version of the Red Sea Party, which I watched again on YouTube this week, Moses shouts out, "Do not be afraid, God will fight for us." And then, without any further ado, he lifts his staff and the water parts. But there was a key scene that Charles read for us this morning from Exodus that's omitted from that drama. It's the scene before the water parts. What's missing is the scene, maybe off camera, when Moses casts an uncertain eye up to God, as if to say, well, now what? I've told him not to worry. And we hear God say to Moses, maybe a bit exasperated, "Why do you cry to me? Go forward." "Moses," God seems to say, "haven't I done enough yet? What must I do to convince you? I don't want you enslaved by all this fear, tortured by it, frozen by it, unable to be all who you can be because you're afraid. Go forward, man, it'll be okay." And so the first step is taken out into the soggy sea, and the people follow along, even though they're afraid too, and then the water parts. They go forward, trusting enough that God wants their freedom. And the Egyptians, their enslavers, no longer control them after that point. Now that's a story with legs. What makes you afraid? Ties you up in knots, fettering you to one place, one way of thinking, one way of acting. Have you identified that thing that's called the trigger in your life that produces in you almost a knee-jerk response, a recurring reaction like spinning tires? And it doesn't move you forward, but holds you back as if you're tethered. That automatic, maybe visceral response you have, so you're not really making a free choice. For each of us, the trigger is different depending upon our past. In the last 2 weeks, I've been painfully reminded of how strongly I want to be seen as successful at what I do. My fear ingrained in me as a minister's kid who had to be proper under so many watchful eyes. I wanted to make sure I was seen in a good light. I don't want to fail to meet standards. And of course, few of us do want to fail, but for me, this fear can be strong as an iron manacle on my ankle, and I'll work really hard to avoid it. Others of you may be afraid of having someone think you're not a loving person, or not an original artist or thinker, and you'll avoid those labels at all cost. Some of us fear not understanding things fully, or fear our ideas may be ignored. You might relieve your fears by seeking another's permission all the time, or by rebelling as if you don't really care what others say. You might be the kind of person who likes to avoid all those unpleasant things, including fear. You fixate instead only on the beautiful things of life. You may grapple with anger, so intent on being a peacemaker that you're out of touch with your own anger, or convinced that anger is a character flaw, so you squelch any of those feelings that are legitimate. Some have no trouble being angry, but deep down, perhaps if you are one of them, you fear its power because you've seen its consequences. Each of us is different, you see, but we each have our own powerful pharaohs that make us afraid, that seem to charge at us just when we think we're free. We come up to the edge of deep seas of grief or depression, aghast that we've been caught again in this trap of fear, and we despair at navigating the way across by ourselves. We're so small. The way ahead so unclear. In times like this, might the Holy say to you, go forward. You're intended to live free of those fears that hold you back. But you really need to freely choose it. Go forward. And then together we'll find a way where none had seemed possible. Earlier this month, the New York Times Sunday magazine carried an interview of Marilynne Robinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Gilead, most recently Lila. She's now 70 years old. The article began with Robinson's statement, quote, I hate to say it, but I think a default posture of human beings is fear. The article continued, perched on the edge of a sofa, hands loosely clasped, Robinson leaned forward as if breaking bad news to a gentle heart. What it comes down to, and I think this has become prominent in our culture recently, is that fear is an excuse for us not doing what we need to do, what we ought to do. Oh, I would have liked to have done something about it, but of course I couldn't. Fear, says Robinson, has in this moment a respectability I've never seen in my life. And then she probes a layer deeper, suggesting that today one of our greatest fears is to imbue the stories of our life with a sense of the sacred. If we can find an interpretation for what occurs that leaves God and the sacred out of it, we will. Says Robinson, quote, there are prohibitions of an unarticulated kind that are culturally felt now that prevent people from actually saying what they think. Students whom she teaches, even those who are Jewish or Catholic who seek her out because they know she's sympathetic to religion, they too feel an inhibition against describing the sacred. It's as if when you describe something good, she says, you're being deceived or being deceptive. Fear has come to keep us at bay from our best selves. We fear saying, I sense a sacredness in things. But says the article's writer, Robinson's work is not held back by this fear. It is unified by her belief in a sacred world whose wonders we have difficulty opening ourselves to privately or publicly. Being human beings, said Robinson, means we're invested with a degree of value that we can't honor appropriately, an overabundance that is magical. There's an intrinsic worth in a human being. We're given to each other in trust. And when you look at the meaning of your own life worth so much, might the sacred be there working with you as the Hebrews interpreted their experience at the Red Sea? What is the meaning of the times in your life when you've thought there was no way out of your dilemma, but then you found a way as amazing as if waters had parted before you? You go forward and God makes a way. Maybe you're both acting together in some partnership that seems, sacred? Isn't that the way real transformation happens? The way peoples are freed. Although it could just be our own doing by ourselves with no room for the sacred. What do you think? Last week I received an email from my aunt in San Francisco. She was reminding me of the 25th anniversary of the 1989 earthquake that had devastated that city. Bob and I were there when it happened. We were visiting with our daughter, then 18 months old, in town for my cousin's wedding. We had come out a week early before the wedding and drove south of the city along Coastal Road 1, so we could stay a few days in the Big Sur area. And it was a Tuesday when we were driving back north. I was at the wheel, intending to take that spectacular coast road north again. Why wouldn't we? We were on vacation. But something odd happened at the fork in the road, and I can't explain it. I've never been able to. But I suddenly took the right fork and far less scenic route. A small portion of that road at the time went through the city of Salinas, and we were stopped at a traffic light. It's really the only time we stopped in that whole several-hour drive. And I felt something that seemed like a huge truck behind us, making our little rental car bounce. And slowly we realized we were in the earthquake. Very slowly. Much later, we learned that had we taken that other fork, the narrow coast road along the cliffs, we would have been in the Santa Cruz Mountains on that little road near the epicenter when the quake struck. But there in Salinas, because I was still on autopilot, once the rolling ground settled and the stoplight turned green again, I just drove up onto the ramp into the highway, and Bob was fiddling with the dial, trying to get the World Series game back again. I noticed a state trooper on the other side racing towards us with his lights flashing, and he stopped in the high-speed lane over there, just stopped. Came running across the median to where we were driving frantically, flagging us to a stop, and then he wedged a flare into the 1-foot-high stair step just ahead of my tires that had been created by the quake. We could easily have hit it at 70 miles an hour. I just drove around it and continued on. And though the highway behind us, we later